My name is Margaret Thompson, but most people call me Maggie. At 68, I've lived through enough seasons to know when winter is coming, and last November, I felt the first frost in my own living room. My daughter Jessica stood beside my mantelpiece, running her manicured fingers along the family photos while my son Michael scrolled through real estate apps on his phone. They thought I was losing my mind because I mentioned my Swiss banking connections again. They exchanged those looks, the ones children give each other when mom starts telling stories about the good old days. But what if the woman they labeled as a confused grandmother was actually the one person in the room who knew exactly what she was doing? What if every rambling story about international finance was actually a warning they were too arrogant to hear? And what if the accounts they didn't believe existed were about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their lives? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain drummed against my kitchen window as I stood at the sink, washing the same coffee mug I'd been using for 20 years. My hands moved automatically through the motions while my mind wandered to the conversation I'd overheard 3 days earlier. Jessica's voice had carried through the thin walls of my modest ranch house in Beaverton, sharp and confident as she spoke to someone on the phone. She keeps talking about Swiss bank accounts and international investments. Yesterday, she told Rosa that she used to handle million-dollar transfers back in the 80s. It's getting worse, and honestly, I think we need to consider our options before she does something really dangerous with what little money she has left. I'd set down my tea and listened as my own daughter dismissed 35 years of my professional life as the fantasies of a deteriorating mind. The irony wasn't lost on me. For decades, I'd managed the financial portfolios of some of the wealthiest families on the West Coast, facilitating investments that spanned continents and currencies. I'd spoken fluent German with Swiss bankers who trusted me with their clients' most sensitive transactions. I'd navigated the labyrinthine world of international finance when most people still wrote checks by hand and thought foreign exchange was something that happened to other people. Yet now, in my own home, surrounded by the diplomas and awards, I'd earned over 3 decades in banking. My children saw only an elderly woman whose stories grew more elaborate with each telling. The truth is, I never stopped working, even after I officially retired in 1998. The connections I'd built with Credit Suisse didn't vanish when I turned in my employee badge. The relationships I'd cultivated with wealth management specialists in Zurich didn't disappear when I started collecting Social Security. What my children didn't understand, what they couldn't comprehend in their narrow view of their mother as a small-town librarian who'd never traveled beyond Seattle, was that I'd been quietly building something extraordinary for over 3 decades. The morning Rosa arrived for her shift, I was already dressed and waiting by the front door. She looked surprised to see me up so early, her kind face creased with concern as she balanced her nursing textbooks against her hip. Rosa Martinez had been coming to help me 3 times a week for the past year, ever since Jessica insisted I needed supervision after David passed. What started as a reluctant arrangement had become one of the most genuine friendships I'd had in years. Rosa listened when I talked about my banking days, asked thoughtful questions about international finance, and never once suggested that my memories were confused or exaggerated. "Mrs. Thompson, you're up early today. Are you feeling all right?" Rosa's voice carried the slight accent that reminded me of the months I'd spent in Geneva, working with bankers whose first languages were French, German, and Italian. In that cosmopolitan world, linguistic diversity was a strength, not something to be hidden or apologized for. I gestured toward the kitchen table where I'd laid out a manila folder. "Rosa, I need to show you something important." She followed me across the hardwood floors that David and I had installed ourselves 40 years ago, when we were young and thought we'd live in this house forever. Now the wood showed its age in places, small scratches and worn spots that Jessica saw as evidence of decline rather than evidence of life fully lived. "Do you remember what I told you about my work at International Banking Solutions?" I asked, watching Rosa's face carefully. She nodded, settling into the chair across from me with the same attention she brought to her nursing studies. "You said you helped wealthy people invest their money internationally. You worked with banks in Switzerland and handled very large accounts." Rosa's recollection was precise, detailed. Unlike my children, she actually listened when I spoke. I opened the folder and removed a document that I'd retrieved from my safety deposit box the day before. The letterhead was understated but unmistakable. Credit Suisse Private Banking, Zurich. The address was printed in elegant font, and below it a quarterly statement dated just 6 weeks earlier. "This is my account summary, Rosa. I've been receiving these statements every 3 months for 37 years. Rosa leaned forward, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers. I watched her expression change as she processed what she was seeing. The account balance, displayed in both Swiss francs and US dollars, represented more money than most people see in their entire lifetimes. The transaction history showed consistent quarterly dividends, annual interest payments, and the steady compound growth that comes from leaving investments untouched for decades. "Mrs. Thompson," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible above, the rain that had started again outside. This says you have over $2 million. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of years of careful planning and patient investing. 2.3 million to be exact, plus some additional investments in pharmaceutical stocks and technology funds that have performed quite well over the past few years. I turned the page to show her the detailed breakdown of my portfolio. "What you're looking at, Rosa, is what my children think doesn't exist." Rosa sat back in her chair, holding the statement like it might dissolve if she gripped it too tightly. "But why don't they know? Why haven't you told them?" The question I'd been asking myself for months finally had a clear answer. Because they've made it very clear that they think I'm losing my mind. Yesterday, Michael called Dr. Morrison to discuss having me evaluated for dementia. Jessica has been researching memory care facilities and telling people that I'm becoming a danger to myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They're not interested in what I actually have to say. They're interested in what they think I should be saying at my age. I retrieved another document from the folder, this one bearing the logo of a law firm in Lake Oswego. This arrived in yesterday's mail. It's a petition for financial conservatorship, filed by Jessica and Michael. They want legal authority to manage my finances and make decisions about my living situation. The petition states that I suffer from delusions about wealth and investment accounts that don't exist. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. "They're trying to take control of your money?" "They're trying to take control of everything," I corrected. "My house, my accounts, my medical decisions, my living arrangements. According to this petition, I'm no longer competent to manage my own affairs." I pointed to a particular paragraph in the legal document. "They've scheduled a competency hearing for next month. If the judge agrees with their assessment, I'll be declared legally incompetent, and everything I own will be managed by people who think my life's work was imaginary." The rain had intensified, creating a steady rhythm against the windows that matched the pounding of my heart. For weeks, I'd felt the walls closing in around me, the familiar sensation of being underestimated and dismissed that I'd experienced throughout my career in a male-dominated industry. But this time was different. This time, the people trying to silence me were my own children. Rosa reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "What are you going to do?" I smiled for the first time in days, feeling something I hadn't experienced since David's death. The thrill of a well-planned strategy finally coming together. "I'm going to remind them that the woman they think is delusional spent 35 years outmaneuvering people much smarter and more powerful than they are. I'm going to show them what happens when you mistake silence for weakness and patience, for confusion." I stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where David and I had planted roses that still bloomed every spring despite years of minimal care. Rosa, do you know what I learned in my years working with Swiss bankers? The most successful people are the ones who plan for scenarios others can't imagine. While everyone else is focused on immediate gains, they're thinking decades ahead. While others make noise, they make moves. I turned back to face her, and I could see in her expression that she understood the significance of what I was about to tell her. For the past 3 years, since David passed, I've been preparing for this exact situation. Every conversation where Jessica dismissed my stories, every time Michael suggested I was confused, every instance where they treated me like an inconvenient burden rather than their mother, I was documenting it. I was preparing. Rosa's eyes widened. What kind of preparing? I returned to the table and opened the folder completely, revealing sections I hadn't shown her yet. Financial records going back 40 years, proving every claim I've ever made. About my career and investments. Medical evaluations from Dr. Morrison confirming my mental competency. Audio recordings of conversations where Jessica and Michael discussed their plans to have me declared incompetent. And most importantly, a complete restructuring of my financial arrangements that they know nothing about. I pulled out a final document, this one bearing the seal of a Portland law firm specializing in elder law. I've retained Sarah Chen as my attorney. She's seen cases like this before, where adult children attempt to seize control of assets they believe they're entitled to inherit. According to Sarah, what Jessica and Michael are attempting is a form of financial elder abuse, and it's both illegal and surprisingly common. Rosa shook her head slowly. They really think you're confused about having millions of dollars? They think I'm confused about everything, I replied. They think my stories about working with international clients are fantasies. They think my knowledge of currency markets and investment strategies is something I picked up from watching too much financial television. They think the woman who managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars somehow became incompetent the moment she turned 65. I gathered the documents and returned them to the folder, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a complex plan finally ready for execution. What they don't realize, Rosa, is that I've been giving them every opportunity to know the truth. Every story I told about my banking days was an invitation for them to ask questions, to show interest in my life and career. Every mention of my Swiss connections was a chance for them to engage with my actual history, instead of the simplified version they've created in their minds. Rosa was quiet for a moment, processing everything I'd shared. What happens next? I walked to the kitchen counter where I'd been keeping a small notebook, the kind I'd used throughout my banking career to track important phone calls and meetings. Next, I make a few phone calls to Zurich. It's been several years since I've spoken directly with my wealth management team, but some relationships transcend time and distance. Then I schedule some meetings here in Portland with people who remember when Maggie Thompson was considered one of the most skilled international banking specialists on the West Coast. I opened the notebook to a page filled with names and phone numbers, many with international prefixes. Rosa, my children are about to learn that the mother they've dismissed as a delusional grandmother still has connections they never imagined. They're about to discover that the woman they think is losing her mind has spent 3 years meticulously planning for exactly this scenario. The rain was beginning to lighten, and thin streams of sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting patterns on the kitchen floor. I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced since David's funeral, when I'd stood graveside listening to Jessica and Michael discuss how quickly we could sell the house and get Mom settled somewhere more appropriate. You know what the most satisfying part will be? I asked Rosa, who was still studying the legal documents with the focused attention she brought to everything important. It won't be proving that I have money. It won't be showing them the account statements or the investment portfolios. It will be watching them realize that every time they called me delusional, every time they dismissed my stories as confused, rambling, they were actually hearing the truth from someone who achieved more in her career than they've accomplished in their entire lives. Rosa looked up from the papers, her expression mixing admiration with concern. Are you sure you want to fight this? It sounds like it's going to be very difficult. I thought about her questions seriously, considering the months of legal battles and family conflict that lay ahead. Then I thought about David, who'd always encouraged me to trust my instincts and never back down from people who underestimated me simply because of my age or gender. I thought about the younger women like Rosa, working multiple jobs and studying, nursing while caring for elderly clients who deserve to see that getting older doesn't mean getting weaker. Rosa, I said finally, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who let others define their reality, and those who insist on telling their own truth. For the past 3 years, I've let my children define me as a confused widow who tells tall tales about her imaginary banking career. I've allowed them to treat me like a burden and plan my future without consulting me. But I've also been quietly preparing to remind them who I really am. I closed the notebook and returned it to its place on the counter. Tomorrow morning, I'm calling my contact at Credit Suisse to arrange a video conference with my wealth management team. Then I'm meeting with Sarah Chen to finalize our strategy for the competency hearing. By the end of the week, Jessica and Michael are going to receive some very interesting documents that will force them to reconsider everything they think they know about their delusional grandmother. Rosa gathered her nursing textbooks and prepared to leave for her afternoon classes, but she paused at the front door. Mrs. Thompson, can I ask you something personal? I nodded, curious about what had been on her mind throughout our conversation. Why didn't you ever tell them the truth directly? Why didn't you just show them the bank statements and prove that your stories were real? It was the question I'd been avoiding, even in my own thoughts. The answer required me to admit something about my relationship with my children that I'd been reluctant to face. Because I wanted them to ask Rosa. I wanted them to show enough interest in my life to inquire about my career, my achievements, my experiences. I wanted them to see me as more than just their aging mother who needed to be managed and protected. I looked around the living room, at the bookshelves filled with financial journals and international banking publications, at the framed certificates from Swiss banking institutes, at the photographs from business trips to European financial centers. Everything they needed to know about who I am and what I've accomplished has been right here in this house for years. They chose not to see it because it didn't fit their image of who I should be at this stage of my life. Rosa nodded slowly, understanding something about family dynamics that went beyond our immediate situation. So this isn't just about money. It's about respect. It's about being seen for who you actually are instead of who people assume you are, I confirmed. And it's about refusing to disappear quietly just because other people find your truth inconvenient. After Rosa left, I stood alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence that had become my constant companion since David's death. But this silence felt different now. Instead of emptiness, it felt like potential. Instead of isolation, it felt like preparation. I walked to my bedroom and opened the small safe where I kept my most important documents. Inside, alongside my passport and David's life insurance policy, was a business card I'd been saving for exactly this moment. The card was simple, elegant, with embossed lettering that read, Dr. Heinrich Miller, Senior Vice President, Private Wealth Management, Credit Suisse. Below his name, in smaller text, was a handwritten note. Maggie, your expertise and integrity made you one of our most valued partners. We remain available should you ever need our assistance. I'd received that card 15 years ago, during my last official visit to Zurich. At the time, I'd thought my international banking days were behind me, that retirement meant stepping away from the complex world of wealth management and foreign exchange. But as I held the card now, I realized that some doors never truly close. They just wait for the right moment to be opened again. Tomorrow, I would make the call that would begin the process of reminding my children who their mother really is. Tomorrow, I would start dismantling their carefully constructed narrative about my declining mental state and their rightful inheritance. Tomorrow, the woman they'd dismissed as a delusional grandmother would begin to reclaim her voice, her dignity, and her power. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Margaret Thompson was going to sleep peacefully, knowing that the game was about to change. And this time, she held all the cards. The morning light filtered through my bedroom curtains with the kind of pale November brightness that makes everything look washed out and fragile. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my nightgown, holding the cordless phone with trembling fingers. The number I'd dialed belonged to Dr. Patricia Morrison, my physician for the past 15 years, but the conversation I'd just finished felt like talking to a stranger. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Morrison had said in that careful, professional tone, doctors use when they're delivering news they know you won't want to hear. "I've received a request from your daughter Jessica to discuss your recent cognitive changes. She's scheduled an appointment for you next week to evaluate your mental capacity." I'd asked what Jessica had told her, though I already suspected the answer. "She mentioned that you've been having episodes of confusion, talking about financial accounts that don't seem to exist, and showing signs of paranoid thinking about family members. She's concerned that you might be developing dementia or another form of cognitive decline." The phone had felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I listened to my own daughter's lies being repeated back to me by someone I trusted. "Dr. Morrison, in all the years you've known me, have I ever shown any signs of cognitive impairment? Have I ever seemed confused during our appointments or unable to manage my affairs?" There had been a long pause before she answered. "No, Maggie. You've always been sharp, articulate, and completely oriented. That's why I was surprised when Jessica called. But families often notice changes before medical professionals do, especially subtle ones that might not be apparent during brief office visits." After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my bedroom, surrounded by the familiar objects that had anchored my life for decades. David's reading glasses still lay on his nightstand, exactly where he'd left them the morning he'd suffered his fatal heart attack. My jewelry box, a gift from my Swiss banking colleagues when I'd facilitated a particularly complex international merger, sat open on my dresser, revealing the elegant watch and pearl earrings I'd worn to countless business meetings in Zurich and Geneva. Everything in this room told the story of a life fully lived, professionally successful, and intellectually engaged. Yet my own daughter was painting a picture of mental decline to medical professionals, creating a paper trail that would support her legal petition for conservatorship. The vulnerability I felt in that moment wasn't physical. At 68, I was healthier than many people 20 years younger. It was the vulnerability of realizing that the people closest to you are capable of betraying fundamental truths about who you are. I rose from the bed and walked to my closet, where my professional wardrobe from my banking days still hung in perfect order. Suits in navy and charcoal gray, silk blouses in cream and powder blue, the kind of conservative yet elegant clothing that had signaled competence and reliability in boardrooms across 2 continents. I selected a navy suit I'd worn to a particularly important meeting with Credit Suisse executives in 1994 when we'd structured a complex investment portfolio for a technology entrepreneur who'd later become one of the wealthiest people in Silicon Valley. As I dressed, muscle memory took over. The precise way I'd learned to tie a silk scarf, the careful application of makeup that enhanced rather than concealed, the selection of jewelry that conveyed success without ostentation. For 35 years, these daily rituals had prepared me to enter a world where my expertise was valued, where my opinions carried weight, where my intellect was respected rather than questioned. Now, as I stood before my bedroom mirror, I saw both versions of myself reflected back. The professional woman who'd navigated international finance with skill and confidence, and the elderly mother whose own children viewed her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be heard. The contrast between these 2 realities felt like living in 2 different universes simultaneously. The doorbell rang just as I finished applying my lipstick, the same shade of rose I'd worn to every important business meeting for the past 20 years. I walked through my living room, past the bookcases filled with financial journals and international banking publications that Jessica and Michael had never bothered to examine, past the framed photographs from business trips to Swiss Financial, centers that they'd dismissed as vacation pictures. Through the front window, I could see Jessica's silver Lexus in my driveway, its pristine surface reflecting the pale morning light. She emerged from the car with the brisk efficiency she brought to everything in her life, her real estate agent persona firmly in place. Professional blazer, designer handbag, phone pressed to her ear as she finished what sounded like a conversation about property valuations and market conditions. I opened the door before she could ring the bell again, and her expression immediately shifted from business-focused to what I'd come to recognize as her dealing with mom face. A careful blend of patience, condescension, and barely concealed frustration that she probably thought looked like loving concern. "Mom, you look nice today," she said, though her tone suggested surprise rather than genuine compliment. "Are you going somewhere special?" "I'm going to the bank," I replied simply. "There are some financial matters I need to discuss with my advisors." Jessica's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mom, we've talked about this. You don't have advisors. You have a checking account at the local credit union and your Social Security direct deposit. When you start talking about financial advisors and international banking, it makes people worry about your mental state." I studied my daughter's face, noting the way she'd perfected the art of dismissing my reality while maintaining a veneer of concern. "Jessica, what do you think I did for a living before I retired?" She sighed, the kind of exasperated exhale that suggested we'd had this conversation too many times before. "You worked at the library, Mom. You were a librarian for most of your career, and before that you had some kind of clerical job at a bank. You've always had a tendency to make your work history sound more important than it actually was." The casual cruelty of that statement hit me like a physical blow. In one sentence, Jessica had reduced 35 years of professional achievement to clerical work and self-aggrandizement. The woman who'd managed international portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who'd been trusted by Swiss banking executives with their most sensitive transactions, who'd spoken at financial conferences and published articles in industry journals, had been rewritten as a small-town librarian with delusions of grandeur. "I see," I said quietly. "And what about the certificates on my wall? The ones from the Swiss Banking Institute and the International Association of Financial Advisors?" Jessica glanced toward the living room, where my professional credentials were displayed in frames that had grown dusty from years of being ignored. "Mom, anyone can buy certificates online these days. Or maybe you took some continuing education classes when you worked at the bank. That doesn't make you an international finance expert." I felt something cold settle in my chest, a kind of clarity that comes when you finally understand just how completely you've been erased from your own narrative. "Jessica, why are you here this morning?" "I wanted to talk to you before your appointment with Dr. Morrison next week. I know you're going to be upset about the evaluation, but it's really for your own good. We're worried about you, Mom. The stories you tell about Swiss bank accounts and international clients are getting more elaborate, and it's starting to affect how people see you in the community." She moved into my living room without invitation, settling onto my sofa with the kind of territorial confidence that suggested she'd already mentally redecorated the space. "Mrs. Patterson next door mentioned that you told her you used to manage investments for European millionaires. Do you understand how that sounds to people who know your actual background?" I remained standing by the front door, watching my daughter make herself comfortable in the home where I'd lived for 4 decades. "How does it sound, Jessica?" "It sounds like someone who's losing touch with reality. It sounds like someone who might not be safe living alone anymore." She opened her designer handbag and pulled out a manila folder, the same kind I'd used to organize my banking files for years. "I've been researching some very nice senior living communities, places where you'd have companionship, activities, and most importantly, professional supervision to make sure you're taking care of yourself properly. The folder contained glossy brochures for memory care facilities, each one featuring photographs of elderly people engaged in simple activities like painting with watercolors or playing board games. The images were clearly designed to convey comfort and safety, but to me they looked like prisons dressed up as recreation centers. "This one is particularly nice," Jessica continued, pointing to a brochure for Sunset Manor. "They specialize in residents with cognitive challenges, and they have a wonderful program for people who experience confusion about their past or have difficulty distinguishing between reality and fantasy." I finally moved from the doorway, walking to my bookshelf where I kept a particular volume that had special significance. It was a leather-bound directory of international banking professionals, published by the World Bank in 1995. I opened it to a page I'd bookmarked years earlier and handed it to Jessica. "Would you read the entry under T for Thompson, Margaret?" I asked. Jessica glanced at the page reluctantly, her eyes scanning the text with obvious skepticism. "Margaret Thompson, Senior Vice President, International Banking Solutions, Portland, Oregon. Specializes in European investment portfolios and Swiss banking relationships. Certified by the Swiss Banking Institute in International Wealth Management. Author of numerous publications on cross-border financial transactions." She looked up from the book with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom, this could be anyone with the same name, or it could be an old directory that's not accurate. People make mistakes in these kinds of publications all the time." I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out a document I'd kept for sentimental reasons. A letter of recommendation written by the president of Credit Suisse when I'd left. International Banking Solutions to take early retirement. The letter, printed on official bank letterhead and bearing an embossed seal, detailed my contributions to international banking relationships and specifically mentioned my role in managing portfolios exceeding $500 million. Jessica barely glanced at the letter before setting it aside. "Mom, it's very easy to create fake documents these days. The internet is full of templates for official-looking papers. The fact that you feel the need to prove these stories suggests that on some level, they're not entirely true." I sat down across from my daughter, studying her face for any sign that she was genuinely confused rather than deliberately obtuse. What I saw was the expression of someone who had decided on a particular version of reality and was determined to maintain it regardless of contradictory evidence. "Jessica," I said carefully, "what would it take to convince you that my banking career was real? What kind of proof would you accept?" She considered the question with the kind of patronizing thoughtfulness she probably used with difficult real estate clients. "Mom, I think what's happening is that you've created these elaborate stories as a way of coping with getting older and feeling like your life wasn't as significant as you wanted it to be. It's actually very common among elderly people, especially those who feel isolated or unimportant." The psychological diagnosis delivered with such casual confidence was perhaps the most devastating part of the entire conversation. Jessica wasn't just dismissing my professional history, she was pathologizing my need to be seen accurately. According to her analysis, my insistence on truth was actually evidence of mental illness. "The important thing," she continued, "is that we get you the help you need before these fantasies become completely divorced from reality. Dr. Morrison is going to do a thorough evaluation, and I'm confident she'll recommend the kind of care that will help you distinguish between what actually happened in your life and what you wish had happened." I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where David and I had spent countless hours planning and planting. The roses we'd selected together still bloomed every summer, tended now by a gardening service that Jessica had insisted I hire after declaring me too frail to maintain my own yard. "What about Michael?" I asked. "Does he share your assessment of my mental state?" Jessica's expression grew slightly more animated, as if she were relieved to move to a topic where she felt more confident. "Michael is actually the one who first noticed how much your stories were changing. He said that when Dad was alive, you never mentioned international banking or Swiss accounts. According to him, all this talk about European clients and million-dollar portfolios started after Dad died, which is another sign that you're using fantasy as a way to cope with grief and loneliness. The manipulation in that statement was so elegant that I almost admired its construction. By suggesting that my professional identity had emerged only after David's death, Jessica was simultaneously invalidating my career and pathologizing my grief. Any attempt to defend my accomplishments could be dismissed as evidence of an unhealthy coping mechanism. "I see," I said. "So, in Michael's opinion, I never mentioned my international banking work while David was alive." "That's right. He's been very concerned about the change in your personality since Dad passed. You've become more insistent about these stories, more defensive when people question them, and more isolated from friends and family who try to help you stay grounded in reality." I turned from the window to face my daughter directly. "Jessica, would you like to know why I never discussed my banking career with you and Michael when your father was alive?" She looked slightly wary, as if she sensed that she might not like the answer. "Why?" "Because David asked me not to. When I took early retirement and started working part-time at the library, he was concerned that if you knew about our Swiss investments and international accounts, you might make financial decisions based on an inheritance you weren't guaranteed to receive. He wanted you to build your own careers and security, rather than depending on what we might leave behind." Jessica's expression remained skeptical, but I could see that this explanation carried enough plausibility to give her pause. "Even if that were true?" "Mom, it doesn't explain why you would keep such significant assets secret from us now, when we're trying to help you manage your affairs." "But you're not trying to help me manage my affairs," I replied. "You're trying to have me declared incompetent so you can manage them yourselves. There's a significant difference between those two approaches." Jessica's mask of patient concern finally slipped, revealing the frustration that had been building throughout our conversation. "Mom, you're proving my point. This paranoid thinking, this idea that your own family is conspiring against you, is exactly the kind of behavior that suggests you need professional help." She gathered the brochures for memory care facilities and returned them to her folder. "I'm going to be honest with you. Michael and I have already consulted with an attorney about the conservatorship process. We're not doing this to hurt you or to steal from you. We're doing it because we love you, and we can see that you're not capable of making rational decisions about your future." The casual mention of legal consultation felt like the final confirmation of everything I'd suspected. My children hadn't stumbled into the idea of seeking guardianship. They'd been planning it systematically, consulting professionals and building a case for my incompetency while maintaining the pretense of loving concern. "What did the attorney tell you?" I asked. "He said that given your age and the documented changes in your mental state, a judge would likely approve a limited conservatorship that would allow us to manage your finances and living situation while still preserving some of your personal autonomy. He said cases like this are actually quite common when elderly parents refuse to acknowledge their declining capacity." I walked Jessica to the front door, maintaining the same polite demeanor I'd cultivated through decades of difficult business negotiations. "Thank you for coming by, Jessica. I appreciate you taking the time to explain your concerns." She paused on my front porch, clearly surprised by my calm reaction. "I hope you'll think seriously about what I've said, Mom. We really do want what's best for you." After she left, I stood in my living room surrounded by the evidence of a life and career that my own family had systematically erased from their understanding of who I was. The diplomas, the professional awards, the photographs from international business trips, the books and journals that documented my expertise, all of it invisible to children who had decided that their elderly mother was incapable of having achieved anything significant. But as I looked around my home, I realized that Jessica and Michael had made a critical error in their assessment of my character. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my patience for confusion, and my love for them for helplessness. What they didn't understand was that their mother had spent 35 years in a profession that required strategic thinking, careful planning, and the ability to outmaneuver opponents who underestimated her capabilities. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Rosa, calling during her lunch break between nursing classes. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling today? You seemed tired when I left yesterday." "I'm actually feeling quite energized, Rosa. Jessica stopped by this morning to discuss her plans for my future, and the conversation was very illuminating." "What kind of plans?" I told her about the memory care brochures, the scheduled appointment with Dr. Morrison, and Jessica's confident assertion that a conservatorship was both necessary and inevitable. As I spoke, I could hear Rosa's sharp intake of breath at several points in the story. "Mrs. Thompson, this is happening so fast. Are you ready for what comes next?" I walked to my bedroom and opened the small safe where I kept my most important documents. Inside, next to my passport and the business card, from Dr. Heinrich Muller at Credit Suisse, was a phone number I'd written on a piece of paper 3 years earlier. It belonged to Sarah Chen, the elder law attorney who'd given a presentation at the community center about protecting seniors from financial abuse. "Rosa," I said, "I think it's time to make that call to Switzerland. And then I think it's time to remind my children that the woman they're trying to silence has more resources at her disposal than they ever imagined." As I dialed the international number, I felt something I hadn't experienced since David's death. The excitement of a well-planned strategy finally ready for execution. My children thought they were dealing with a confused elderly woman whose stories were becoming increasingly divorced from reality. They were about to discover that they'd been underestimating someone who'd spent her entire career turning disadvantages into victories. The phone rang once, twice, then connected to a voice speaking crisp, accented English. "Credit Suisse Private Banking, Zurich. This is Dr. Muller's office." "This is Margaret Thompson calling from Portland, Oregon. I'd like to schedule a video conference with Dr. Muller regarding my account portfolio. It's time to discuss some changes to my investment strategy." There was a brief pause, then the sound of computer keys clicking. "Mrs. Thompson, we have your account information here. Dr. Muller will be delighted to speak with you. We've been wondering when you might contact us again. How does tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Zurich time work for your schedule?" I calculated. The time difference quickly, a skill that had become automatic during my banking years. "That would be midnight here in Portland. Could we make it 8 a.m. your time instead?" "Of course. Dr. Muller asked me to mention that your portfolio performance has been quite exceptional over the past few years. The pharmaceutical and technology investments you approved before your husband's passing have exceeded all projections." After I hung up, I sat quietly in my bedroom, surrounded by the memories and mementos of a career that my children had convinced themselves never existed. Tomorrow evening, I would speak with Swiss banking executives who remembered when Margaret Thompson's financial expertise was sought after by some of the wealthiest families in Europe. Tomorrow evening, I would begin the process of reminding my children who their mother really was. But tonight, I would continue to be the confused, delusional grandmother that Jessica and Michael had created in their minds. Because sometimes, the most powerful position is the one where your opponents have no idea how strong you really are. The video call with Dr. Heinrich Muller began at exactly 11 p.m. Portland time, the screen of my laptop illuminating my darkened living room with the cool blue glow of international connection. Through the camera, I could see the familiar wood-paneled office in Zurich, where Dr. Muller sat behind the same mahogany desk where we'd conducted business for over 2 decades. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the early morning hour in Switzerland, and his expression carried the warm professionalism that had made him one of the most trusted private wealth managers in Europe. "Margaret, how wonderful to see you again," he said, his slight German accent lending gravity to words that carried genuine affection. "I was beginning to worry that we might have lost touch permanently after David's passing. Please accept my belated condolences. He was a remarkable man, and I know how much he meant to you." The simple acknowledgement of my loss, delivered with such sincerity, almost brought me to tears. For 3 years, I'd been surrounded by people who treated David's death as an inconvenience that had somehow made me less capable, rather than a profound loss that had changed my entire world. Dr. Muller's recognition of my grief as legitimate and significant felt like being seen clearly for the first time in months. "Heinrich, thank you. David always spoke highly of your guidance over the years. He used to say that our Swiss investments were the smartest financial decision we ever made, largely because of your expertise." I paused, gathering my thoughts for what I knew would be a delicate conversation. "I'm calling because I need to make some changes to my account structure, and I may need documentation of my financial position for legal purposes here in the United States." Dr. Muller's expression grew more serious. "Legal purposes. Margaret, is everything all right? Are you facing some kind of dispute or investigation?" I explained the situation as clearly and objectively as I could, describing Jessica and Michael's petition for conservatorship, their claims about my mental incompetence, and their insistence that my stories about international banking were fantasies created by a deteriorating mind. As I spoke, I watched Dr. Muller's face transform from concern to something approaching disbelief. "Let me understand this correctly," he said when I finished. "Your own children are claiming that your banking career never existed and that your Swiss accounts are imaginary? They've told medical professionals that you suffer from delusions about wealth and international investments?" "That's exactly right. According to them, I was a small-town librarian who has developed elaborate fantasies about a banking career that never happened. They believe my mentions of Swiss connections and European clients are evidence of cognitive decline." Dr. Muller leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slowly. "Margaret, this is perhaps the most absurd thing I've heard in 40 years of private banking. Your expertise in international finance was legendary among our clients. The portfolio structures you developed in the 1990s are still considered models of sophisticated wealth management. Some of our current strategies are based on innovations you pioneered during your time with international banking solutions." He turned to his computer screen, typing rapidly. "Let me pull up your complete file so we can review your position. I want you to have every piece of documentation you might need to prove not only that your accounts exist, but that your professional reputation in international banking was exceptional." As Dr. Muller navigated through files, I felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. Here was someone who remembered not just the money I'd accumulated, but the professional skill and expertise I'd brought to its management. In his voice, I heard echoes of the respect I'd earned through decades of careful work. The recognition that my children had systematically erased from their understanding of who I was. "Your primary account shows a current balance of $2.4 million US," he reported. "That represents an increase of approximately 100,000 from our last statement, largely due to the performance of the pharmaceutical stocks you selected in 2019. Your secondary account, which holds your European equity positions, has grown to 850,000, and your precious metals allocation, which you established during the 2008 financial crisis, is now worth approximately 300,000. I took notes as he spoke, documenting figures that represented not just financial security, but decades of careful planning and strategic thinking. Each investment decision had been based on research and analysis that my children would probably dismiss as lucky guesses if they knew about them. Dr. Muller, I need more than just account balances. I need documentation that establishes my professional credibility and the legitimacy of my banking relationships. My children have convinced medical professionals that I'm delusional, and I need to prove otherwise. Of course, I'll prepare a complete dossier for you. Letters of reference from our executive team, documentation of your professional certifications through the Swiss Banking Institute, records of the major transactions you facilitated during your career, and testimonials from clients whose portfolios you managed. Would it be helpful if I also prepared a statement for legal proceedings that attests to your mental acuity and professional competence? The offer was exactly what I needed, but hearing it made the full scope of my situation more real. I was preparing for a legal battle with my own children, gathering evidence to prove my sanity and competence to strangers who would decide my future based on documents and testimony. Yes, that would be incredibly valuable. I also need to restructure my accounts to ensure that if anything happens to me, my assets are protected from mismanagement by people who don't understand their nature or origin. Dr. Muller's expression grew concerned. Margaret, are you in any physical danger? Should we be taking immediate steps to protect you beyond financial planning? Not physical danger, but legal vulnerability. My children are planning to have me declared incompetent, and if they succeed, they'll gain control of assets they don't even believe exist. I need to ensure that my wealth is managed by professionals who understand its complexity rather than family members who see it as imaginary. I understand completely. We can establish an irrevocable trust structure that places your assets under Swiss banking protection while still allowing you full access and control during your lifetime. If anything were to happen to your legal capacity in the United States, your wealth would remain under our management rather than being subject to local guardianship laws. The conversation continued for another hour, covering technical details of international trust law and Swiss banking regulations that I absorbed, with the same focused attention I'd brought to such discussions throughout my career. As we spoke, I felt my professional identity reasserting itself, the part of my mind that had navigated complex financial structures awakening after years of dormancy. When the call ended, I sat in my darkened living room surrounded by pages of notes that documented not just my financial position, but my legitimate claim to expertise in international banking. For the first time since David's death, I felt like Margaret Thompson, the banking professional, rather than Maggie, the confused grandmother. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was in my kitchen, preparing coffee and reviewing the key notes from my call with Dr. Muller when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the window, I could see Michael climbing out of his black BMW, his phone pressed to his ear as he finished what sounded like a heated conversation with someone about quarterly revenue projections and client retention strategies. Michael had inherited David's height and my analytical mind, but where I'd learned to balance intellect with patience, my son had developed a kind of aggressive efficiency that served him well in technology sales, but made him exhausting to be around for extended periods. He approached problems like obstacles to be overcome through persistence and superior reasoning, rather than challenges to be understood through careful observation. "Mom," he said as I opened the front door, "we need to talk. Jessica told me about her conversation with you yesterday, and I'm concerned about some of the things she said you claimed." I invited him in, noting that he immediately began surveying my living room with the kind of calculating assessment that suggested he was already mentally preparing for estate sales and property transfers. His gaze lingered on my furniture, my artwork, the personal possessions that represented decades of shared life with David. "What specific claims are you concerned about, Michael?" I asked, settling into my favorite armchair while he remained standing, pacing slightly as he organized his thoughts. "Jessica said you showed her some kind of banking directory and a letter that you claimed proved your international finance career was real. She said you seemed genuinely convinced that these documents were authentic, which worries me because it suggests your confusion is becoming more sophisticated." The phrase "more sophisticated" struck me as particularly revealing. According to Michael's analysis, my supposed delusions were evolving, becoming more elaborate, and therefore more dangerous. The possibility that my documents were genuine didn't seem to have occurred to him. "Michael, what do you remember about my work before I started at the library?" He stopped pacing and looked at me with the kind of patient expression people use when dealing with someone they consider fundamentally unreliable. "Mom, you worked at First National Bank downtown for a few years in the 1980s. You were a teller, maybe an assistant manager toward the end. It was a perfectly respectable job, but nothing like what you've been describing to people lately. I walked to my filing cabinet and pulled out my employment records from International Banking Solutions, documents that detailed my progression from junior analyst to senior vice president over 15 years. Michael glanced at them briefly before setting them aside. These could be fake, Mom. With computers today, anyone can create official-looking documents. The fact that you feel the need to prove these stories suggests that part of you knows they're not entirely accurate. The dismissal was so casual, so complete, that I realized Michael had moved beyond skepticism into a realm where contradictory evidence simply couldn't penetrate his established beliefs. He'd decided that his mother was suffering from cognitive decline, and any information that challenged that assessment was automatically suspect. Michael, why would I create fake documents about a banking career? What would I gain from such an elaborate deception? I think you're trying to feel important again, he said, his tone carrying what he probably thought was compassionate understanding. After Dad died, you lost your primary identity as his wife. Working at the library part-time doesn't provide much sense of professional accomplishment. Creating stories about being an international banking expert makes you feel valuable and significant. The psychological analysis, delivered with such confidence, was even more devastating than Jessica's accusations of confusion. Michael wasn't just questioning my memory. He was pathologizing my entire sense of self. According to his assessment, my professional identity was a fantasy constructed to compensate for feelings of inadequacy and loss. What about the certificates? On my wall? The ones from Swiss banking institutions and international finance organizations? Michael glanced toward my professional credentials with the same dismissive expression Jessica had shown. Mom, you can buy those online for $20. Or maybe you took some weekend seminars when you worked at the bank and you've inflated their significance over the years. Memory is unreliable, especially as we age. I stood and walked to my bookshelf, selecting a volume I'd authored in 1992 on international currency exchange strategies. The book, published by a respected financial press, contained my photograph and biographical information that clearly established my credentials and expertise. I handed it to Michael, watching his face as he opened it to the author page. This says it was written by Margaret Thompson, but that could be a different person with the same name. Even if it's really you, writing one book doesn't make someone an international banking expert. Lots of people write books about subjects they don't really understand professionally. The mental gymnastics required to maintain his position in the face of mounting evidence was impressive in its persistence. Michael had constructed a version of reality where his mother was incapable of significant professional achievement, and he was determined to preserve that version regardless of contradictory information. Michael, I said carefully, if these documents and credentials and publications are all fake or insignificant, why are you and Jessica so concerned about my mental state? If I'm just a confused elderly woman telling harmless stories, why do you feel the need to seek conservatorship? The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment, his confident demeanor wavered. Because the stories are getting more elaborate and more specific. You're talking about specific amounts of money, naming Swiss banks, giving details about international transactions. That level of delusion could lead you to make dangerous financial decisions. What kind of dangerous decisions? You might try to access accounts that don't exist, which could expose you to fraud. You might make investment decisions based on expertise you don't actually have. You might fall victim to scams targeting elderly people who think they have more assets than they really do. The irony was profound. Michael was concerned that my supposed delusions about wealth might make me vulnerable to people trying to steal money I didn't actually have, while simultaneously planning to gain legal control over assets he didn't believe existed. Michael, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I need you to consider the possibility that you've misunderstood my background and capabilities. What if the banking career I describe is real? What if the Swiss accounts I mention actually exist, What if your mother is exactly who she says she is? Then you would have shown us proof years ago, he replied immediately. If you really had millions of dollars in Swiss accounts, why would you live in this modest house? Why would you work part-time at the library? Why would you let Jessica and me struggle financially when you could have helped us? The questions revealed assumptions about wealth and family obligation that explained much about his motivations. In Michael's worldview, having money meant displaying it conspicuously and sharing it generously with adult children. The concept of maintaining financial privacy or allowing children to build their own security was foreign to him. Perhaps, I said, because your father and I believed that you and Jessica should create your own success rather than depending on inheritance. Perhaps because we thought financial independence would serve you better than financial dependence. That's convenient reasoning for someone who doesn't actually have significant assets to share, Michael replied. Mom, I know this is difficult to hear, but these elaborate stories are becoming a problem. Yesterday, you told Mrs. Patterson next door that you used to manage investments for European royalty. Do you understand how that sounds to people who know your actual background? I hadn't told Mrs. Patterson anything about European royalty, but I realized that my stories were being filtered through multiple conversations and probably distorted in each retelling. What I'd actually said about working with wealthy European clients was being transformed into increasingly dramatic versions as it passed from person to person. Michael, what did Jessica tell you about her conversation with Dr. Morrison? She said Dr. Morrison agreed that you should be evaluated for cognitive changes. She said the doctor was concerned when she heard about your increasing confusion and the paranoid thoughts about family members conspiring against you. The word paranoid stung particularly sharply because it pathologized my accurate perception of what was actually happening. My children were conspiring to have me declared incompetent, but recognizing that conspiracy was being labeled as a symptom of mental illness. What happens after the evaluation with Dr. Morrison? Michael's expression grew more serious, and I could see him shifting into the kind of problem-solving mode he probably used with difficult clients. If she confirms what we suspect about your cognitive decline, we'll petition the court for limited conservatorship. It's not about taking away your independence, Mom. It's about making sure you have appropriate support for decisions you're not equipped to make anymore. And if I disagree with Dr. Morrison's assessment? If I refuse to accept conservatorship? Then we'll present evidence to the court that demonstrates your incapacity. We have documentation of your increasing confusion, statements from community members about your grandiose claims, and medical professional opinion about your cognitive state. A judge will make the final determination based on the evidence. The casual confidence with which Michael discussed stripping away my legal autonomy was breathtaking. He spoke about conservatorship proceedings like they were routine business transactions, problems to be solved through proper documentation and legal process. Michael, before you proceed with this plan, I want you to consider something. What if you're wrong about my mental state? What if the mother you're trying to protect from her own delusions is actually the same woman who spent 35 years successfully managing complex financial portfolios? What if the stories you're dismissing as fantasies are actually accurate, memories of a career you never bothered to understand? Then you would prove it, he said simply. You would show us bank statements, account information, documentation that couldn't be explained away as confused memories or fabricated evidence. You would demonstrate your supposed expertise through actions rather than stories. I walked to my desk and pulled out the business card Dr. Moeller had given me years earlier, the one with his direct contact information and the handwritten note about remaining available for assistance. I handed it to Michael, watching his face as he read the embossed lettering and examined the quality of the cardstock. This is the private contact information for a senior vice president at Credit Suisse in Zurich. If you call that number and ask about Margaret Thompson's account relationship with their bank, you'll receive information that might change your assessment of your mother's mental capacity. Michael studied the card carefully, and I could see him weighing the possibility that it might be genuine against his established belief in my confusion. "Mom, even if this card is real, it doesn't prove you have significant accounts with this bank. Maybe you met this person once, or maybe you did some minor business with them years ago and you've inflated the relationship over time." "Then call and ask," I replied. "Verify my claims directly with Swiss banking professionals who have no reason to participate in any supposed delusions. I'm not going to make international phone calls based on a business card that could have come from anywhere," Michael said, but I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "If you really have significant Swiss accounts, you would provide statements, transfer records, something more substantial than a business card and stories about your banking days." I realized that Michael had created an impossible standard of proof that would allow him to dismiss any evidence I provided. Bank statements could be forged, transfer records could be fabricated, and professional relationships could be exaggerated or misremembered. He'd positioned himself to reject any documentation while maintaining that his skepticism was reasonable and protective. "Michael, I understand your concern for my welfare, and I appreciate that you believe you're acting in my best interests. But I need you to consider the possibility that the conservatorship you're planning isn't necessary or appropriate. I need you to consider that your mother might be exactly who she says she is. And I need you to consider the possibility that your stories about international banking and Swiss accounts are symptoms of a condition that requires professional treatment," he replied. "We're not doing this to hurt you, Mom. We're doing this because we love you and want to protect you from the consequences of decisions you're not equipped to make anymore." After Michael left, I sat in my living room surrounded by the evidence of a professional life that my own children had convinced themselves never existed. The books I'd written, the awards I'd received, the photographs from business trips to financial centers across Europe, all of it invisible to people who had decided that their elderly mother was incapable of significant achievement. But as I reviewed my notes from the conversation with Dr. Muller and considered Michael's confident assertions about my supposed delusions, I realized that my children had made a critical strategic error. They had based their entire plan on the assumption that I was a confused elderly woman with no resources beyond a modest checking account and Social Security benefits. They had no idea that the mother they were trying to silence had spent the previous evening coordinating with Swiss banking executives who still considered her one of their most valued former partners. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Rosa, calling between her afternoon classes to check on my well-being. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling today? You sounded very determined when I talked to you yesterday, and I wanted to make sure you're taking care of yourself." "Rosa, I'm feeling more like myself than I have in months. Last night I had a video conference with my wealth management team in Zurich, and this morning Michael stopped by to explain his plans for my future. Both conversations were very educational." "What did the Swiss bankers say?" I told her about Dr. Muller's offer to provide complete documentation of my professional credentials and account relationships, his proposal for protecting my assets through international trust structures, and his willingness to provide testimony about my mental competence for legal proceedings. And what did Michael say? I described Michael's casual dismissal of all evidence supporting my banking career, his confident assertion that conservatorship proceedings were inevitable, and his refusal to verify my claims through direct contact with Swiss banking professionals. "Mrs. Thompson, it sounds like they're not interested in the truth. They've decided what they want to believe about you, and they're not going to let facts change their minds." "You're absolutely right, Rosa. And that realization has been very liberating, because it means I don't need to waste any more energy trying to convince them of who I am. I can focus entirely on proving it to the people who matter: medical professionals, legal authorities, and banking regulators who have the power to protect me from what my children are planning. What's your next step?" I walked to my desk where I'd been organizing documents and contact information for the past 2 days. "Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with Sarah Chen, the elder law attorney who specializes in cases like mine. Then, I'm scheduled for a comprehensive medical evaluation with an independent physician who has experience with competency assessments. And next week, I'm expecting a courier delivery from Switzerland with documentation that will establish my professional credentials beyond any reasonable doubt. It sounds like you're building a very strong case. I'm not building a case, Rosa. I'm revealing the truth. There's a significant difference between those two approaches, and my children are about to learn what happens when you mistake strategy for delusion and patience for weakness. The following morning, I drove to Sarah Chen's office in downtown Portland, navigating traffic patterns I hadn't dealt with since my banking days. The law firm occupied the 32nd floor of a gleaming tower that hadn't existed when I'd worked in international finance, and from Sarah's conference room, I could see the Willamette River winding through a city that had transformed dramatically during my retirement years. Sarah Chen was a woman in her early 50s with the kind of sharp intelligence that had probably served her well in law school and continued to intimidate opponents in elder law disputes. She listened to my story with focused attention, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her familiarity with conservatorship abuse cases. "Mrs. Thompson," she said when I finished explaining my situation, "what you're describing is unfortunately more common than most people realize. Adult children who assume their aging parents have become incompetent often proceed with legal action before conducting any objective assessment of their parents' actual mental capacity." She pulled a thick folder from her filing cabinet and set it on the conference table between us. "I've handled dozens of cases where families attempted to gain conservatorship based on assumptions rather than evidence. The good news is that you have significant resources and documentation to defend yourself. The challenging news is that these proceedings can be emotionally devastating even when the outcome is favorable. What do I need to know about the legal process? First, you need to understand that the burden of proof is on the petitioners, your children, to demonstrate that you lack capacity to manage your affairs. However, many judges are predisposed to err on the side of caution when it comes to elderly individuals, especially when family members express concern about cognitive decline." Sarah opened the folder and pulled out several documents that looked like court forms and legal templates. "Second, you need to be prepared for your children to present evidence that paints your claims about banking expertise and Swiss accounts as delusional thinking. They'll argue that your insistence on these fantasies demonstrates poor judgment and possible cognitive impairment. And third, you need to be ready to prove not just that your accounts exist and your career was real, but that you currently possess the mental capacity to manage complex financial decisions. The court will want evidence of your present competency, not just your past achievements." Sarah reached for another file that contained what looked like medical reports and psychological evaluations. "I'm going to recommend that you undergo comprehensive testing with Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a neuropsychologist who specializes in competency evaluations. Her assessment will carry significant weight with the court, and her report will either support or undermine your children's claims about your mental state." "What kind of testing?" "Cognitive function assessments, memory evaluations, psychological profiles, and specific tests designed to measure capacity for financial decision-making. The process takes about 4 hours and covers everything from basic orientation to complex problem-solving skills." I felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of having my mental capacity formally evaluated, even though I was confident in my cognitive abilities. There was something unsettling about submitting to tests designed to measure whether I was competent to control my own life. "Sarah, what happens if the court grants conservatorship despite evidence of my competency?" "Then we appeal, and we continue fighting until we exhaust all legal options. But Mrs. Thompson, I want you to understand something important. The fact that you're here, speaking coherently about complex legal and financial matters, demonstrating clear understanding of the situation and appropriate concern for your future, None of that suggests cognitive impairment to me." She leaned forward, her expression growing more intense. "I've been practicing elder law for 20 years, and I've seen genuine cases of diminished capacity. I've also seen families who convince themselves that their aging parents are incompetent, because it's easier than acknowledging that those parents have lives and expertise beyond what their children understand. Which category do you think my case falls into? Based on our conversation today, I think your children have made assumptions about your capabilities that aren't supported by evidence. But I also think they genuinely believe those assumptions are correct, which makes them more dangerous than children who are deliberately trying to defraud their parents." Sarah gathered the documents we'd been reviewing and organized them into a neat stack. "Mrs. Thompson, I want you to go home and prepare for battle. Gather every piece of documentation that supports your claims about your banking career and financial position. Contact everyone who can provide testimony about your professional competence and current mental acuity. And most importantly, don't let your children's dismissive attitude make you question what you know to be true about yourself." As I drove home from Sarah's office, I felt the familiar combination of anxiety and excitement that had always preceded major challenges in my banking career. The legal battle ahead would require the same strategic thinking, careful preparation, and patient execution that had served me well in international finance. The main difference was that this time, I wasn't fighting for clients or portfolios. I was fighting for my own identity and autonomy. That evening, I received an email from Dr. Mueller with an attachment containing more than 50 pages of documentation. Letters of reference from Swiss banking executives, records of major transactions I'd facilitated during my career, certificates from international finance institutions, and a detailed statement attesting to my professional competence and current mental acuity. As I reviewed the documents, I realized that Dr. Mueller had provided more than just evidence of my banking credentials. He'd created a complete professional portfolio that established not just what I'd accomplished, but how I'd accomplished it. The letters described specific innovations I'd developed, complex problems I'd solved, and the respect I'd earned from colleagues and clients across 2 continents. Reading about my career through the eyes of Swiss banking professionals reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten during the past 3 years of grief and isolation. I had been exceptionally good at what I did. The woman my children were trying to dismiss as a confused librarian with delusions of grandeur had actually been one of the most skilled international banking specialists of her generation. But more importantly, I realized that the strategic mind that had navigated complex financial negotiations for 35 years was still intact, still capable of planning and executing sophisticated responses to challenging situations. My children thought they were dealing with a vulnerable elderly woman who could be easily manipulated through legal proceedings and medical evaluations. They were about to discover that they'd been underestimating someone who had spent her entire career turning apparent disadvantages into decisive victories. The quiet grandmother they'd dismissed as delusional was actually a financial strategist who'd been preparing for this exact scenario for 3 years. The game was about to change, and this time, I held all the cards that mattered. The neuropsychological evaluation with Dr. Amanda Rodriguez took place on a crisp December morning in a medical building that overlooked the Columbia River. I arrived 30 minutes early, sitting in my car to collect my thoughts before undergoing tests that would formally measure my mental capacity. The irony wasn't lost on me that at 68, I was being required to prove my competence to manage affairs I'd been handling successfully for decades. Dr. Rodriguez's office was designed to put patients at ease, with soft lighting and comfortable furniture that felt more like a living room than a medical facility. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that suggested extensive experience with elderly patients facing similar evaluations. "Mrs. Thompson, I understand you're here because of concerns raised by family members about your cognitive capacity. Before we begin the formal testing, I'd like you to tell me in your own words why you think this evaluation is necessary." I explained the situation carefully, describing my children's beliefs about my supposed delusions, their plans for conservatorship, and their dismissal of my professional background. As I spoke, Dr. Rodriguez took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of the complex family dynamics involved. "What I find interesting," she said after I finished, "is the specificity and consistency of your accounts. People experiencing true delusions typically tell stories that change with each telling, becoming more elaborate or contradictory over time. Your descriptions of your banking career and financial position have remained remarkably consistent according to the notes I've received." The testing process was comprehensive, covering everything from basic orientation and memory recall to complex problem-solving and financial decision-making scenarios. I answered questions about current events, performed mathematical calculations, analyzed hypothetical investment scenarios, and demonstrated my understanding of legal concepts related to financial management. One particular section focused on my ability to detect and avoid financial fraud, a skill that Dr. Rodriguez explained was often compromised in people experiencing cognitive decline. She presented me with various scenarios involving suspicious investment opportunities, high-pressure sales tactics, and requests for personal financial information. My responses, honed by decades of experience in international banking, apparently impressed her with their sophistication and accuracy. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to ask you some questions about your banking career that might seem unusual, but I want to assess your ability to recall specific professional experiences rather than general stories you might have rehearsed," she asked, me to explain the regulatory differences between Swiss and American banking systems, describe the documentation required for international wire transfers, and detail the process for establishing offshore investment accounts. My answers drew on technical knowledge accumulated over 35 years of practice, knowledge that would be impossible to fabricate or memorize without genuine professional experience. "Can you walk me through how you would structure an international investment portfolio for a client with significant assets who needed to minimize tax exposure while maintaining liquidity?" I spent 15 minutes describing a complex multi-jurisdictional approach that involved Swiss private banking, Cayman Islands incorporation, and carefully timed transfers that would optimize tax efficiency while complying with international reporting requirements. The strategy I outlined was sophisticated enough that Dr. Rodriguez stopped taking notes and simply listened with obvious fascination. "Mrs. Thompson, the level of expertise you've just demonstrated is far beyond what someone could acquire through casual reading or weekend seminars. The technical knowledge you possess about international banking regulations and investment strategies reflects extensive professional experience and ongoing intellectual engagement with complex financial concepts." When the formal testing concluded, Dr. Rodriguez reviewed my results with an expression that suggested the outcomes were decisive rather than marginal. "Your cognitive function scores are in the superior range for your age group. Your memory, both short-term and long-term, is excellent. Your problem-solving abilities and judgment show no signs of impairment. Most significantly, your capacity for financial decision-making is not only intact, but demonstrates sophistication that exceeds most people regardless of age." She handed me a preliminary summary of her findings, explaining that the full report would be available within a week. "Mrs. Thompson, based on this evaluation, I see no evidence of cognitive decline, dementia, or any condition that would impair your ability to manage your financial affairs. The concerns raised by your family members don't appear to be supported by objective assessment of your mental capacity. What about my claims regarding Swiss bank accounts and international banking experience? Do those seem delusional to you?" Dr. Rodriguez smiled for the first time during our session. "Mrs. Thompson, delusions are typically characterized by beliefs that are clearly false and not based in reality. Your knowledge of international banking is too detailed and technically accurate to be fabricated. Your understanding of Swiss banking regulations and investment strategies demonstrates genuine professional expertise. If your family members believe these claims are delusional, I would suggest that they don't understand the breadth of your professional background. Driving home from the evaluation, I felt a profound sense of validation that went beyond the immediate legal implications. For months, I'd been surrounded by people who treated my professional identity as a fantasy, who pathologized my need to be seen accurately. Dr. Rodriguez's assessment confirmed what I'd known all along. There was nothing wrong with my mind, my memory, or my judgment. That afternoon, Rosa arrived for her regular visit to find me organizing documents in my dining room. The table was covered with papers from Switzerland, medical reports, legal filings, and correspondence with Sarah Chen's office. The volume of documentation created an impressive display of evidence that supported every claim I'd made about my background and capabilities. "Mrs. Thompson, you look different today. More confident, maybe?" "I feel like myself again, Rosa. For the first time in 3 years, I've spent time with professionals who recognized my expertise, rather than dismissing it as confusion." I told her about the neuropsychological evaluation, Dr. Rodriguez's assessment, of my cognitive abilities, and her confirmation that my banking knowledge was genuine rather than delusional. What did she say about the conservatorship case? She said that based on her evaluation, there's no objective evidence to support claims that I lack capacity to manage my affairs. Her report will recommend against any form of guardianship or conservatorship. I pulled out the preliminary summary and read from Dr. Rodriguez's conclusions. The patient demonstrates superior cognitive function, excellent judgment, and sophisticated understanding of complex financial matters. No evidence of impairment that would justify external management of her affairs. Rosa sat down across from me, studying the organized documents with obvious admiration. This is like watching someone prepare for the most important presentation of their life. "In many ways, that's exactly what this is," I replied. "Next week, I have a meeting with Jessica and Michael's attorney to discuss their conservatorship petition. The week after that, I'm scheduled for a hearing where a judge will determine whether I'm competent to control my own life. Everything I've gathered here will determine the outcome of those proceedings." I walked Rosa through the documentation systematically, explaining how each piece contributed to the overall picture of my professional competence and current mental capacity. Letters from Swiss banking executives who'd worked with me for decades, records of complex transactions I'd facilitated, certificates from international finance institutions, medical evaluations confirming my cognitive abilities, and legal briefs prepared by Sarah Chen's firm. "Rosa, look at this letter from Dr. Muller's supervisor at Credit Suisse." I handed her a document on official bank letterhead that detailed my professional relationship with their institution. It describes me as one of the most skilled international banking specialists we've had the privilege of working with, and states that my expertise in cross-border wealth management was sought after by clients throughout Europe and North America. Rosa read the letter carefully, shaking her head in amazement. "Mrs. Thompson, this makes Jessica and Michael sound completely ridiculous. How could they not know about any of this? Because they never asked, and I never insisted on telling them." For years, David and I thought it was better to let them build their own careers without depending on knowledge of our financial position. We wanted them to develop independence and self-reliance, rather than entitlement and dependence. I pulled out another document. This one, a detailed analysis of my investment portfolio prepared by the Swiss wealth management team. This shows that our decision to maintain financial privacy was correct. Look at how they're behaving now, when they think I have only modest assets. Imagine how they would have acted if they'd known about millions of dollars they considered their inheritance. Rosa studied the investment analysis, which showed steady growth in my portfolio over 3 decades of careful management. They're trying to take control of money they don't even know exists. Exactly, and that irony is about to become very expensive for them. I opened a folder containing correspondence with Sarah Chen about legal costs and potential damages. Rosa, what Jessica and Michael don't understand is that filing false conservatorship petitions carries significant legal consequences. If the court determines that their claims about my incapacity were unfounded, they could be liable for my legal expenses, court costs, and potentially damages for attempted financial abuse. How much money are we talking about? I pulled out Sarah Chen's fee estimate and damage assessment. Legal costs alone could exceed $50,000. If the court finds that their actions constituted attempted financial exploitation, damages could reach into the hundreds of thousands. Swiss banking law provides additional protections against attempted seizure of international assets, which could trigger criminal charges under federal financial crimes statutes. Rosa's eyes widened as she processed the potential consequences. They have no idea what they've gotten themselves into. They think they're dealing with a confused elderly woman who can be easily manipulated through legal proceedings. They're actually dealing with someone who spent 35 years outmaneuvering people much more sophisticated than they are. I gathered the documents and returned them to their organized folders. Rosa, my children are about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between appearing vulnerable and actually being weak. The meeting with Jessica and Michael's attorney took place the following Thursday in a conference room that overlooked Pioneer Courthouse Square. Thomas Bradley was a probate lawyer in his 60s who specialized in guardianship and conservatorship cases, and his initial demeanor suggested he expected this to be a routine proceeding involving a confused elderly woman and concerned family members. Mrs. Thompson, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. I understand this situation is difficult for everyone involved, but I want you to know that your children are acting out of genuine love and concern for your welfare. Sarah Chen, who'd accompanied me to the meeting, responded before I could speak. Mr. Bradley, my client is here to address the allegations in your conservatorship petition, which we believe are without merit and potentially constitute financial elder abuse. Bradley's expression shifted slightly, suggesting he hadn't expected to encounter serious legal opposition. Ms. Chen, my clients have documented evidence of Mrs. Thompson's declining cognitive capacity, including statements from medical professionals and community members who've observed concerning changes in her behavior and judgment. What specific evidence? Sarah asked, pulling out a legal pad to take notes. Bradley opened a file and began reading from what sounded like prepared talking points. Mrs. Thompson has been telling people that she worked as an international banking expert, that she managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and that she currently has accounts with Swiss banks containing substantial assets. Family members report that these claims have become more elaborate and detailed over time, suggesting progressive cognitive decline. Sarah looked at me, and I nodded to indicate that I was ready to respond. Mr. Bradley, I'd like to address those allegations directly. I pulled out the documentation package I'd prepared, setting it on the conference table where both attorneys could examine it. These are letters from senior executives at Credit Suisse in Zurich, confirming my professional relationship with their bank and detailing my expertise in international wealth management. These are account statements showing current balances in excess of $3 million. These are professional credentials from Swiss banking institutions that certified my expertise in cross-border financial transactions. Bradley examined the documents with obvious skepticism, but I could see his expression changing as he processed what he was reading. The letterhead was clearly authentic, the language was technically sophisticated, and the financial figures were specific enough to be easily verified. Mr. Bradley, these are also results from a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who found no evidence of cognitive impairment and specifically noted that my financial knowledge demonstrates genuine professional expertise rather than delusional thinking. Sarah handed Bradley her own set of documents. These are medical records from Mrs. Thompson's primary physician confirming her excellent cognitive function over 15 years of care. These are testimonials from colleagues who worked with her during her banking career. And these are legal briefs documenting similar cases where families attempted conservatorship based on misunderstanding rather than evidence. Bradley was quiet for several minutes as he reviewed the materials, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific documents or technical details. His initial confidence had been replaced by obvious concern about the strength of his client's case. "Mrs. Thompson, if these Swiss accounts are real, why didn't you inform your children about them? Why allow them to believe you had only modest assets?" "Because my late husband and I believed that financial independence was more valuable than financial dependence. We wanted Jessica and Michael to build their own careers and security rather than waiting for inheritance. Their current behavior suggests our decision was correct." Sarah leaned forward, addressing Bradley directly. "Mr. Bradley, your clients filed a conservatorship petition claiming that Mrs. Thompson suffers from delusions about wealth and banking. Expertise that don't exist? The evidence clearly shows that her claims are accurate and that their petition is based on ignorance rather than medical necessity. What are you proposing? Immediate withdrawal of the conservatorship petition, public acknowledgement that the allegations were unfounded, and payment of Mrs. Thompson's legal expenses incurred in defending against these baseless claims." Bradley gathered the documents we'd provided and stood to leave. "I need to discuss these developments with my clients. This is not what I expected to find when I agreed to represent them." "Mr. Bradley," I said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to understand that I don't blame you for accepting this case based on the information Jessica and Michael provided. But I hope you'll advise them that continuing to pursue conservatorship in the face of evidence contradicting their claims could expose them to significant legal liability." After Bradley left, Sarah and I remained in the conference room to discuss strategy for the upcoming court hearing. "Margaret, I think we just won this case. No attorney is going to proceed with a conservatorship petition when the evidence so clearly contradicts the fundamental claims. What happens next? Bradley will meet with your children and explain that their assumptions about your mental capacity and financial position were incorrect. They'll have to decide whether to withdraw their petition voluntarily or face the embarrassment and expense of losing in court." I felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the immediate legal victory. For months, I'd been dismissed as a confused elderly woman whose claims about her professional background were symptoms of cognitive decline. Now, legal professionals who specialized in these cases were acknowledging that I was exactly who I'd always said I was. "Sarah, what are the chances that Jessica and Michael will accept this outcome gracefully?" "Based on my experience with similar cases, probably not good. People who've convinced themselves that their elderly parent is incompetent often have difficulty accepting evidence that contradicts their beliefs. They may interpret your successful defense as proof that you're more cunning than they realized, rather than evidence that you were never impaired." That prediction proved accurate when Jessica called that evening, her voice tight with anger, rather than relief or apology. "Mom, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but Bradley says you've somehow produced documents that make it look like your banking stories are real." "Jessica, the documents don't make it look like my banking career was real. They prove that it was real. Bradley says you claim to have millions of dollars in Swiss accounts. If that's true, why have you been living like you don't have money? Why did you let Michael and me struggle financially when you could have helped us?" The questions revealed the assumptions that had driven their conservatorship attempt. Jessica wasn't upset that she'd misjudged my mental capacity. She was upset that she'd misjudged my financial position. The possibility that I'd been competent all along was less disturbing to her than the possibility that I'd been wealthy all along. "Jessica, your father and I made a conscious decision not to share information about our Swiss investments because we wanted you and Michael to develop your own financial independence. Every struggle you've experienced, every success you've achieved, has been genuinely yours rather than dependent on our assistance. That's a convenient excuse for being selfish with money that should have helped your family. Jessica, the money I earned through 35 years of professional banking work doesn't belong to you and Michael. It belongs to me, and I've managed it according to my own judgment and values. Well, your judgment is about to cost us a lot of money in legal fees for a case we never would have filed if you'd been honest about your situation. I felt a flash of anger at the suggestion that I was somehow responsible for their decision to seek conservatorship. Jessica, you filed that case because you decided I was mentally incompetent without conducting any objective assessment of my capabilities. You created a legal problem based on assumptions rather than evidence. Mom, we're not going to pay your legal expenses just because you managed to fool some attorneys with fake documents and coached responses. The documents aren't fake, Jessica. The Swiss banking relationships are real. The professional credentials are authentic. The neuropsychological evaluation was conducted by an independent expert who found no evidence of cognitive impairment. Then you've gotten very good at manipulating people, which actually proves that you're more dangerous than we thought. The conversation ended with Jessica hanging up, leaving me to contemplate how completely my children had inverted reality to preserve their own self-image. Rather than acknowledging that they'd misjudged my capabilities, they were now suggesting that my competence was evidence of cunning manipulation. The court hearing took place on a gray January morning in the Multnomah County Courthouse. I dressed in the same navy suit I'd worn to important banking meetings decades earlier, carrying myself with the professional confidence that had served me well throughout my career. Jessica and Michael sat with their attorney at one table while Sarah and I occupied another, the formal courtroom setting emphasizing the gravity of proceedings that would determine my legal autonomy. Judge Patricia Williams was a woman in her 50s who'd developed a reputation for careful attention to evidence in complex family cases. She reviewed the case file thoroughly before addressing the parties, her expression suggesting she understood the unusual nature of the dispute. This case involves a petition for conservatorship filed by Jessica Thompson Williams and Michael Thompson, claiming that their mother, Margaret Thompson, lacks capacity to manage her financial affairs due to cognitive decline and delusional thinking about her professional background and current assets. Judge Williams looked directly at me. Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the documentation submitted by your attorney, including medical evaluations, financial records, and professional credentials. Can you explain in your own words why you believe conservatorship is unnecessary? I stood to address the court, feeling the same clarity and focus that had guided me through challenging business negotiations for decades. Your Honor, the petition filed by my children is based on their misunderstanding of my professional background and their dismissal of accurate information about my financial position. I worked for 35 years as an international banking specialist, managing portfolios for wealthy clients and maintaining professional relationships with Swiss financial institutions. When I mentioned these experiences to my family, they interpreted them as fantasies created by a deteriorating mind. I gestured toward the evidence table where Sarah had organized our documentation. The Swiss banking relationships are real and ongoing. The professional credentials are authentic and verifiable. The medical evaluations show no evidence of cognitive impairment. My children filed for conservatorship because they didn't believe my stories about my career, not because I actually lack capacity to manage my affairs. Judge Williams reviewed the neuropsychological evaluation and medical records before addressing Jessica and Michael's attorney. Mr. Bradley, your petition claims that Mrs. Thompson suffers from delusions about wealth and professional achievements that don't exist. However, the evidence suggests that her claims about Swiss bank accounts and international banking expertise are accurate. How do you respond to this apparent contradiction? Bradley rose reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with his position. Your Honor, my clients acted based on their sincere belief that Mrs. Thompson was experiencing cognitive decline. They observed what appeared to be increasingly elaborate stories about a banking career that they didn't believe existed. Their concern was genuine, even if their assessment of the situation was incorrect. Mr. Bradley, do your clients wish to withdraw their petition in light of the evidence presented? Bradley conferred quietly with Jessica and Michael before responding. Your Honor, my clients maintain that Mrs. Thompson's secrecy about her financial position and professional background demonstrates poor judgment that could affect her capacity for sound decision-making. Judge Williams's expression grew stern. Mr. Bradley, maintaining financial privacy is not evidence of incapacity. Mrs. Thompson has demonstrated superior cognitive function, detailed professional knowledge, and careful management of complex financial affairs. The evidence overwhelmingly contradicts your client's claims about her mental state. The judge reviewed the case file one final time before delivering her ruling. The petition for conservatorship is denied. Mrs. Thompson clearly possesses the mental capacity to manage her own affairs, and the allegations of cognitive decline appear to be unfounded. Furthermore, the court finds that the petitioner's claims about delusional thinking were based on their own misunderstanding, rather than objective evidence of impairment. Judge Williams continued, "Given the comprehensive nature of the evidence presented and the apparent lack of merit in the original petition, the court orders the petitioners to pay Mrs. Thompson's reasonable legal expenses incurred in defending against these claims." After the hearing, I stood on the courthouse steps with Sarah, feeling the same sense of accomplishment that had followed successful conclusions to complex banking negotiations. The January air was cold, but crisp, and the gray clouds that had dominated the morning sky were beginning to break apart. "Margaret, you've achieved something significant here beyond just winning this case," Sarah said as we watched Jessica and Michael leave the courthouse without speaking to us. "You've established legal precedent for defending against conservatorship abuse based on family misunderstanding rather than medical necessity. What happens now? Now you go home and live your life on your own terms without interference from people who thought they knew better than you did about your own capabilities." That evening, I called Dr. Muller in Zurich to update him on the legal proceedings. His relief was evident even through the international connection, and his congratulations carried the warmth of someone who'd genuinely worried about my welfare. "Margaret, I must tell you that your situation has been discussed among our executive team here at the bank. We were prepared to provide additional testimony or documentation if needed, and we're delighted that the matter has been resolved in your favor. Heinrich, your support throughout this process has meant more to me than I can express. For months, I felt like I was losing my identity, becoming invisible even to my own family. Your recognition of my professional competence helped me remember who I actually am. Margaret, you are one of the most skilled banking professionals I've worked with in 40 years in this industry. The idea that anyone could consider you incompetent is frankly absurd to those of us who know your capabilities." We discussed potential changes to my investment strategy, given my renewed confidence in managing my own affairs without interference from family members who didn't understand the complexity of my financial position. Dr. Muller suggested some emerging opportunities in renewable energy and biotechnology that aligned with my long-term investment philosophy. "Heinrich, I want to do something with my wealth that honors the struggle I've just been through. Are there opportunities to support other elderly individuals who face similar challenges with family members who underestimate their capabilities?" "Margaret, that's a wonderful idea. There are several organizations that specialize in elder advocacy and financial protection. Your support could make a significant difference for people facing situations similar to what you've experienced." 6 months later, I stood before a group of elder law attorneys, social workers, and financial advocates at a conference in Seattle, sharing my experience as a case study in conservatorship abuse prevention. The audience listened with rapt attention as I described how family assumptions about aging and competence could lead to legal challenges even when no actual impairment existed. "The most important lesson from my experience," I told the conference attendees, "is that being elderly doesn't automatically make someone vulnerable, and telling stories about professional achievements doesn't automatically indicate confusion. Sometimes the person everyone assumes is declining is actually the most capable person in the room." Rosa, who'd driven to Seattle to hear my presentation, waited for me in the hotel lobby afterward. She was finishing her nursing degree and had received a scholarship from the Elder Advocacy Foundation I'd established with funds from my Swiss CA accounts. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm so proud of how you've turned your experience into something that helps other people. When I first met you, I thought you were just a sweet elderly woman with interesting stories. I had no idea I was working for someone who would teach me so much about courage and determination. Rosa, you were the first person in 3 years who listened to my stories instead of dismissing them. Your support helped me remember that I deserved to be heard and believed." We walked through downtown Seattle, past the financial district, where I'd once conducted business meetings with international banking colleagues, past the waterfront where I'd celebrated successful deals with clients from across the globe. The city had changed dramatically since my banking days, but I felt more connected to my professional identity than I had in years. "What's next for you?" Rosa asked as we stopped at a cafe that overlooked Elliott Bay. "I'm thinking about writing. A book about my experience. There are probably other elderly people out there whose families have convinced themselves that professional success stories are symptoms of cognitive decline. Maybe my story could help them defend themselves before the situation reaches the point of legal proceedings." "What would you call it?" I thought about the question seriously, considering how to capture the essence of what I'd learned through months of fighting for my own identity and autonomy. Maybe something like "When Silence Becomes Strategy" or "The Invisible Expert." Something that captures the experience of being dismissed and underestimated until you're forced to prove yourself all over again. That evening, I returned to my house in Beaverton and sat in my living room surrounded by the professional credentials and personal mementos that told the story of a life fully lived. The photographs from business trips to Switzerland, the awards from international banking institutions, the books and journals that documented decades of expertise, all of it visible again to anyone who cared to look. Jessica and Michael had not contacted me since the court hearing, and I'd learned through mutual acquaintances that they were still struggling to understand how their assessment of my capabilities had been so completely wrong. Some part of me hoped that eventually they would recognize the mother they'd almost lost to their own assumptions and prejudices. But whether they ever acknowledged their mistakes or not, I had reclaimed something more valuable than their approval. I had reclaimed myself. The woman who'd been dismissed as a delusional grandmother had proven that age doesn't diminish expertise, that quiet strength is often more powerful than loud protests, and that sometimes the most effective strategy is to let others underestimate you until you're ready to show them exactly who you are. I opened my laptop and began typing the first chapter of my book, starting with a sentence that captured the central truth of my experience. They called me delusional, but I was actually the only person in the room who knew what was real. Outside my window, the Oregon winter rain tapped gently against the glass. But inside my warm house, surrounded by evidence of a career and identity that could never again be erased, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from fighting for your own truth and winning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.